Picture this: a pregnant woman stands before 500 of the city's most powerful people at an exclusive gala. Her husband, a celebrated CEO who just won Entrepreneur of the Year, raises his hand and strikes her across the face. The sound echoes through the ballroom as crystal glasses shatter and cameras start rolling. But this isn't just about domestic violence. Hidden on his phone, she's discovered something that will destroy him completely. Evidence that he's stolen nearly $4 million from a children's cancer charity. Money meant to save dying kids. Gone. And tonight, as her water breaks 24 weeks into her pregnancy, everything is about to explode. Her father, a billionaire media mogul, who's about to unleash the full power of his empire to destroy the man who dared to hurt his daughter. What happens next will shock you. Federal agents, offshore accounts, a mother-in-law involved in systematic poisoning, and a courtroom showdown that ends with justice being served in the most unexpected way possible. This is the true story of how one woman's courage brought down a criminal empire and transformed tragedy into triumph. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about power, justice, and the strength of the human spirit. "Get your hands off me!" Rebecca's scream echoed through the grand ballroom as 500 of the city's elite watched her husband's hand connect with her face. The sound of the slap seemed to freeze time in the Metropolitan Business Gala's opulent ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast glittering light over shocked faces as Rebecca Sterling Whitmore, 6 months pregnant in an emerald silk gown, stumbled backward from the force of her husband's blow. Marcus Whitmore, the 38-year-old tech startup CEO who had just been lauded as Entrepreneur of the Year, stood with his hand still raised, his charming public mask completely shattered, his face contorted with rage as he hissed through clenched teeth. "You don't know what you're talking about, Rebecca. Sit down and shut up." But Rebecca didn't sit down. The woman who had spent months walking on eggshells, carefully managing her husband's moods, suddenly found her voice. Her hand instinctively moved to protect her swollen belly as she spoke loud enough for nearby tables to hear. $3 million. Marcus. $3 million stolen from dying children. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Around them, conversations died as guests turned to stare at the unfolding drama. Phone cameras began emerging from designer clutches and tuxedo pockets. Marcus lunged forward, grabbing Rebecca's wrist with enough force to leave marks. "You're embarrassing yourself. You're pregnant and emotional, and you don't understand business." "I understand theft." Rebecca's voice grew stronger, fueled by months of suppressed rage and the protection of her unborn child. "I understand that you've been stealing from the children's cancer charity I founded, the charity dedicated to my brother's memory." That's when Marcus struck her again. This time, security cameras caught every angle. The second blow sent Rebecca reeling into their table, sending crystal glasses crashing to the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass mixed with gasps from the crowd as Rebecca clutched her stomach, her face pale with shock and pain. From across the ballroom, William Sterling rose from his seat like an avenging angel. The 58-year-old media mogul, whose face graced the Forbes Billionaire list every year, had been watching his daughter with growing concern all evening. He'd noticed how she flinched when Marcus touched her, how she carefully measured her words, how she seemed to shrink beside her husband. Now he watched his pregnant daughter being assaulted in front of the city's most powerful people, and something cold and deadly settled in his chest. William Sterling had built his media empire from nothing, starting with a single community newspaper and growing it into a multimedia conglomerate worth $12 billion. He hadn't survived corporate wars and hostile takeovers by being gentle with those who threatened his family. "Security," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Call 911, now." Marcus spun around, his eyes wild as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Striking his wife in private was one thing, but assaulting her in front of 500 witnesses, including her billionaire father, was quite another. "William, this is a private matter between my wife and me," Marcus said, attempting to reclaim his composure. "Rebecca is having some pregnancy-related emotional issues, and she's confused about some business documents she found on my phone." But William Sterling wasn't listening to Marcus. He was moving through the crowd with purpose, his eyes fixed on his daughter, who was now doubled over in pain. "Rebecca, sweetheart, are you hurt? Is the baby okay?" Rebecca looked up at her father, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in months, she felt safe enough to tell the truth. "Daddy, I found offshore accounts on his phone, shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He's been stealing from the Emma Foundation. From the Children's Cancer Research Fund I started for Tommy." The mention of her deceased brother's name sent a visible shock through William Sterling's face. Tommy had died of leukemia at age 12, and Rebecca had channeled her grief into creating one of the most successful children's cancer charities in the country. The idea that Marcus had been stealing from dying children struck William as the ultimate betrayal. "You're going to regret this," Marcus whispered to Rebecca, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." But before he could say more, Rebecca's face went white with a different kind of pain. She looked down at her emerald dress and saw dark stains spreading across the silk. "Oh God," she whispered, "something's wrong with the baby." The stress of the assault, combined with the emotional trauma of discovering her husband's betrayal, had triggered something in her body. Amniotic fluid began pooling at her feet as contractions started rippling across her abdomen. "My water just broke," she gasped. "But it's too early. I'm only 24 weeks. Panic spread through the ballroom as guests realized they were witnessing not just domestic violence, but a medical emergency. The premature rupture of membranes at 24 weeks meant the baby was in serious danger. Marcus stepped back, his face pale as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Rebecca, you need to get to a hospital." "Don't you dare!" William Sterling's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Don't you dare pretend to care about her now. Security, make sure this man doesn't leave the building until the police arrive." The ballroom erupted in chaos as paramedics arrived and began loading Rebecca onto a stretcher. Her father held her hand as they rushed toward the exit, his face set in grim determination. "Daddy, I'm scared," Rebecca whispered as they moved through the crowd of onlookers. "I know, sweetheart, but you're going to be okay. Both of you are going to be okay, and Marcus is going to pay for what he's done." As the ambulance doors closed, William Sterling pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 20 years. "James, it's William Sterling. I need a favor. A big one." The man on the other end was James Crawford, federal prosecutor and William's former law school roommate. The two men had maintained a friendship despite their different career paths, but William had never asked for professional help before. "What's going on, William?" "My daughter's husband just assaulted her at a public event. She's pregnant and in the hospital. But that's not why I'm calling. She's found evidence that he's been embezzling from her children's cancer charity. We're talking millions of dollars meant for childhood cancer research." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Send me everything you have. If what you're saying is true, this falls under federal jurisdiction, wire fraud, money laundering, potentially racketeering if he's been running a systematic operation." William Sterling smiled grimly as he climbed into his limousine. "Oh, it's true, James, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows it." As the limousine pulled away from the Gala, following the ambulance to the hospital, William began making the calls that would destroy Marcus Whitmore's life. His media empire would ensure that every detail of tonight's assault would be broadcast across the country by morning. But first, he had to make sure his daughter and grandchild survived the night. Behind them, Marcus Whitmore stood in the ballroom surrounded by police officers, his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. The man who had spent years building his reputation as a successful entrepreneur and devoted husband now faced the consequences of his violence and greed. The security footage from the Gala would be played on every news channel in America within hours. But that was just the beginning of Marcus Whitmore's nightmare. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been Rebecca's obstetrician since her medical school days, and she'd never seen her young patient look so broken. As Rebecca was wheeled into the emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah's practiced eye immediately cataloged the visible injuries alongside the obvious medical crisis. "Talk to me. Rebecca, how are you feeling? Are you having contractions?" Rebecca nodded weakly, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. "They started right after Marcus hit me. Dr. Mitchell, the baby's too early. It's only been 24 weeks. Sarah's face remained professionally calm, but inside she was calculating odds and preparing for the worst. At 24 weeks, a baby's survival chances were touch and go, even with the best medical care. "We're going to do everything we can," she said firmly. First, let's get you stabilized and see what we're dealing with. As the medical team worked to assess Rebecca's condition, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench with anger. Along Rebecca's ribs, barely visible beneath her gown, were fading bruises in various stages of healing, yellow-green marks that spoke of injuries weeks old. This wasn't the first time Marcus had hurt his wife. "Rebecca," Sarah said gently, "I need to ask you some questions about these other injuries. When did these happen?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. I fell down the stairs about 3 weeks ago, and last month I walked into a door. I've been so clumsy since I got pregnant." The explanations were textbook victim responses, and Sarah had heard them too many times to count. She'd been a doctor long enough to recognize the signs of systematic domestic abuse. "Honey, I need you to know that you're safe here. No one can hurt you in this hospital, but I need to document these injuries properly, for your safety and the baby's safety." Outside in the waiting room, William Sterling paced like a caged lion. The most powerful media mogul in the country felt completely helpless as he waited for news about his daughter and unborn grandchild. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, colleagues, and business associates who had already seen the footage from the gala spreading across social media. Videos of Marcus striking his pregnant wife had gone viral within an hour, generating millions of views and thousands of outraged comments, but William ignored the calls. His focus was entirely on the emergency room doors, waiting for Dr. Mitchell to emerge with news. When she finally appeared, her expression was cautiously optimistic. "The bleeding has stopped, and Rebecca's vital signs are stable. We've managed to halt the premature labor for now, but she's going to need complete bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. Any stress or physical trauma could trigger labor again." William felt relief wash over him. "And the baby? Strong heartbeat, good movement. We got lucky tonight. William, but I need to talk to you about something else." Dr. Mitchell's expression grew serious as she led William to a private consultation room. "This isn't the first time Marcus has hurt Rebecca. I found evidence of multiple previous injuries, all consistent with domestic violence, rib bruises, finger marks on her arms, even what appears to be an old injury to her wrist that was never properly treated." William's hands clenched into fists. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the healing patterns, I'd say at least 6 months, possibly longer." "William, I have to ask. Did you know?" The question hit William like a physical blow. As a father and as someone who prided himself on being observant, the idea that his daughter had been suffering in silence for months was devastating. "No," he said quietly. "She always seemed careful around him. I thought it was just his personality. He could be controlling, demanding, but I never imagined." "Abusers are often very good at hiding their behavior," Dr. Mitchell said gently, "and victims become experts at covering for them. Rebecca has been protecting Marcus and protecting you from the truth." While they spoke, Rebecca's phone had been buzzing nonstop in her hospital room. Social media notifications, news alerts, and text messages from friends and colleagues who had seen the footage from the gala. But there was one message that stood out from the rest, a text from Marcus, sent just 20 minutes after the ambulance had left the gala. "You've made a terrible mistake tonight. Think about what's best for our child before you say anything else to anyone. I have lawyers and I have resources. Don't make this worse than it has to be." The threatening tone was unmistakable, and Rebecca realized that even from police custody, Marcus was still trying to control her through fear and intimidation. When William returned to her room, he found Rebecca staring at her phone with a mixture of fear and anger. "What is it, sweetheart?" Rebecca showed him the message, and William's expression darkened. "He's threatening you. Even now, even after what he did tonight, he's still trying to intimidate you. Daddy, there's something else I need to tell you. The charity theft isn't the only thing I found on his phone. There were emails about moving money to offshore accounts, messages about liquidating assets, and flight information to countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States." William's media instincts kicked in immediately. "He's planning to run." "I think he was going to wait until after the baby was born, then disappear with everything. Leave me with nothing but debt and a destroyed charity." The scope of Marcus's betrayal was becoming clearer, and William realized they were dealing with something much more sophisticated than simple domestic violence. This was a calculated, long-term plan to defraud both his daughter and the charity. His phone rang, and he saw James Crawford's name on the screen. "James, please tell me you have good news. I've got federal agents reviewing the evidence you sent. If what Rebecca found is accurate, we're looking at wire fraud, money laundering, charity fraud, and potentially racketeering charges. The charity fraud alone carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. William felt a grim satisfaction at those words. "How quickly can you move on this? We're preparing search warrants now. His offices, his homes, his bank records. We'll execute them first thing in the morning. But William, I need to warn you about something." "What is it?" "Marcus made bail an hour ago. He's out of custody." The news hit William like a cold slap. How is that possible? He assaulted a pregnant woman in front of 500 witnesses. His lawyers argued that he was a pillar of the community with no prior record, and the assault charge is only a misdemeanor. The judge set bail at $50,000, which his mother posted immediately. William's mind raced through the implications. Marcus was free, he had access to his resources, and he knew that federal investigators were closing in on him. "James, he's going to run. Rebecca found evidence that he's been planning to flee the country. Then we need to move faster than planned. I'm calling for an emergency warrant hearing tonight. We'll have federal agents at his location within hours." As William ended the call, he realized that the next few hours would be critical. Marcus was desperate, cornered, and potentially dangerous. The man who had been systematically abusing his daughter for months now had nothing left to lose. But William Sterling hadn't built a $12 billion empire by backing down from fights. If Marcus wanted a war, he was about to discover that he'd picked the wrong family to mess with. Outside the hospital, news vans were already setting up for the story that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. The assault at the Gala was just the beginning of a scandal that would expose the dark underbelly of corporate fraud and domestic abuse. But inside room 307, Rebecca Sterling Whitmore lay in a hospital bed, her hand resting on her belly, finally feeling safe enough to hope that her nightmare might be coming to an end. William Sterling hadn't slept in 36 hours, but fury was a better stimulant than any coffee. He sat in Rebecca's hospital room at 6 in the morning, surrounded by laptops, phones, and legal documents that painted a picture of betrayal so systematic it took his breath away. "Show me again," he said to his team of forensic accountants, who had worked through the night analyzing the evidence Rebecca had discovered on Marcus's phone. Patricia Wong, his lead financial investigator, pulled up a flowchart on her laptop screen. "The embezzlement scheme is incredibly sophisticated. Marcus created a network of shell companies, all with names similar to legitimate medical suppliers. The Emma Foundation's accounting department thought they were paying for research equipment and medications, but the money was actually flowing to Marcus's personal accounts." Rebecca, propped up in her hospital bed with monitors tracking her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat, listened in horrified fascination as the scope of her husband's crimes became clear. "How much?" she asked quietly. $3.7 million over 18 months, Patricia replied. "Money that was supposed to fund childhood cancer research, buy equipment for pediatric oncology units, and provide support for families dealing with childhood cancer." The number hit Rebecca like a physical blow. $3.7 million stolen from dying children. Money donated by grieving parents, by corporations trying to make a difference, by community groups holding fundraisers. All of it diverted to fund Marcus's lifestyle and his escape plan. "There's more," Patricia continued. "He's been systematically draining the foundation's reserve accounts. If he had been allowed to continue for another 6 months, the charity would have been completely bankrupt. You would have been forced to close down all programs and lay off the entire staff." William watched his daughter's face crumble as she realized the full extent of the betrayal. The Emma Foundation wasn't just a charity to Rebecca. It was her way of honoring her brother's memory and creating something positive from the tragedy of losing him to leukemia at age 12. "He knew," Rebecca whispered. "He knew how much the foundation meant to me. He knew about Tommy, about why I started it, and he stole from it anyway." The cruelty of that betrayal cut deeper than any physical abuse Marcus had inflicted. Rebecca could understand, in some twisted way, how an abusive husband might justify hitting his wife. But stealing from children with cancer required a level of moral bankruptcy that seemed almost inhuman. William's phone buzzed with a text from James Crawford. Federal agents are in position, executing search warrants in 10 minutes. It's starting, William said grimly. James is about to tear Marcus's world apart. Across the city, at Marcus Whitmore's luxury penthouse, FBI agent Lisa Rodriguez was leading a team of federal investigators through the front door with a search warrant that authorized them to seize computers, financial records, and any evidence related to wire fraud and money laundering. Marcus stood in his living room in a bathrobe, his usual composure completely shattered as federal agents methodically dismantled his carefully constructed facade. "This is harassment," he said to Agent Rodriguez. "My wife is having emotional problems related to her pregnancy. She's making false accusations." Agent Rodriguez, a veteran investigator who had seen her share of white-collar criminals, wasn't impressed by Marcus's performance. "Sir, we have forensic evidence of financial transactions that appear to violate federal law. This isn't about domestic disputes. This is about potential charity fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering." As agents began boxing up computers and financial documents, Marcus realized that his carefully planned escape route was crumbling. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the flight plans to non-extradition countries, all of it was about to be exposed. Back at the hospital, Rebecca was experiencing a different kind of revelation. As she watched her father coordinate the investigation with federal authorities, she began to understand the true scope of her family's power and influence. William Sterling hadn't just built a media empire, he'd built a network of relationships that spanned law enforcement, politics, and corporate America. The man who had spent decades exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable was now turning that machinery against his daughter's abuser. "Daddy," Rebecca said during a quiet moment, "I need to ask you something." "Anything, sweetheart." "Did you know about Marcus before tonight, I mean? Did you suspect something was wrong?" William was quiet for a long moment, and Rebecca could see the guilt and self-recrimination in his eyes. "I knew he was controlling. I saw how you changed after you married him. You became more careful, more guarded. You stopped speaking up in meetings, stopped challenging people's ideas. But I told myself it was just marriage, just you adapting to being part of a couple." "I was afraid," Rebecca admitted. "Not just of what he might do to me, but of what he might do to the foundation. He had access to all the accounts, all the donor information. He said if I ever left him, he'd destroy everything I'd built in Tommy's memory." The confession hung between them like a bridge finally being built across months of silence and fear. "And now he did it anyway," William said grimly. "He destroyed it while staying married to you." "Dr." Mitchell knocked and entered the room, her expression cautiously optimistic. "How are we feeling this morning, Rebecca?" "Physically better, emotionally. I'm not sure I have words for what I'm feeling." "That's completely understandable. You've experienced severe trauma, and your body is still processing everything that happened. The good news is that your vital signs are stable, the baby's heartbeat is strong, and we've successfully stopped the premature labor. How long will I need to stay in the hospital?" "At least another week for observation. After that, complete bed rest at home until the baby reaches full term. Any stress or physical activity could trigger labor again, and we want to keep this little one cooking for as long as possible." As Dr. Mitchell left, Rebecca's phone began buzzing with a flood of notifications. Social media mentions, news alerts, and messages from friends and colleagues who were seeing the story unfold in real time. The hashtag #JustShireEmma Foundation was trending on Twitter as people shared stories about how the charity had helped their families. Childhood cancer survivors posted photos and testimonials. Doctors and nurses from pediatric oncology units shared videos explaining how the foundation's donations had provided critical equipment and support. But mixed in with the support were messages of outrage as news of the embezzlement spread. Donors who had given thousands of dollars to honor deceased children were furious to learn that their money had been stolen. Corporate sponsors were demanding investigations into their own contributions. "This is going to destroy everything," Rebecca said, scrolling through the increasingly angry messages. "Even if we get the money back, who's going to trust the foundation again? Who's going to donate to a charity that was robbed by its founder's husband?" William took his daughter's hand firmly. "Listen to me, Rebecca. We're not just going to get through this. We're going to come out stronger. The foundation is going to survive, and it's going to thrive. because people are going to see that you're a victim here, not a conspirator. But the damage to our reputation will be temporary. Trust me. I know something about managing public perception. By the time we're done telling this story, Marcus will be in federal prison, and the Emma Foundation will be seen as a symbol of survival and justice. At that moment, James Crawford called with an update that would prove William's prediction correct. "We found everything," James said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Computer records, bank statements, communication with offshore account managers, even draft resignation letters where Marcus planned to blame the missing money on embezzlement by Foundation employees." The final detail made Rebecca gasp with anger. Not only had Marcus planned to steal the money, but he'd intended to frame innocent employees for his crimes. "How soon can you arrest him?" William asked. "We're coordinating with local authorities now. Federal charges will be filed within the hour, and he'll be in custody by the end of the day. This time, there won't be any bail." As the call ended, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. For the first time since her wedding day, she could imagine a future free from Marcus's control, manipulation, and violence. But Marcus Whitmore had one more card to play, and he was desperate enough to use it. The text message arrived on Rebecca's phone at exactly 9:15 in the morning, just as federal agents were surrounding Marcus's office building downtown. "I'm coming to see you. We need to talk about our child's future. Don't do anything stupid." Rebecca showed the message to her father, who immediately called hospital security. "No one with the name Marcus Whitmore is allowed on this floor," William instructed the head of security. "And I want someone posted outside my daughter's room at all times." But Marcus had always been clever, and desperation had made him even more cunning. Instead of trying to enter through the main entrance, he used his knowledge of the hospital's layout from previous visits during Rebecca's pregnancy. The executive parking garage had a service elevator that connected directly to the maternity ward, and Marcus still had the access card from when Rebecca had been hospitalized with morning sickness earlier in her pregnancy. He made it to the 7th floor before anyone realized he was in the building. Rebecca was dozing when she heard the familiar sound of his voice in the hallway, arguing with a nurse about visiting hours. Her blood pressure monitor immediately began beeping as her stress level spiked. "He's here," she whispered to her father, who was working on his laptop in the corner of the room. "Marcus is here." William was already moving toward the door when Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking like a man on the edge of a complete breakdown. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his eyes had the wild look of someone who knew his world was collapsing. "Rebecca, thank God you're okay," Marcus said, attempting his old charming smile. "I've been so worried about you and the baby." "Stay away from her," William said firmly, positioning himself between Marcus and Rebecca's bed. "William, I know you're angry, but there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Rebecca found some business documents that she misinterpreted, and things got out of hand last night. But we can fix this. We're family." The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Marcus stood there, knowing that federal agents were probably searching his office at that very moment, and continued to insist that stealing millions from a children's cancer charity was just a misunderstanding. "Get out," Rebecca said, her voice stronger than she'd felt in months. "Get out of here before I call security." "Rebecca, you're being emotional. It's the pregnancy hormones. You need to think about what's best for our child." The condescending tone, the casual dismissal of her intelligence, the way he reduced her to nothing more than a vessel for his child, all of it crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity for Rebecca. "Our child," she said, her voice rising. "You mean the child you put in danger when you hit me. The child who almost died because you couldn't control your temper. The child whose mother you've been systematically abusing for months." Marcus's mask began to slip, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Careful, Rebecca. You don't want to say things you'll regret. I have resources, I have lawyers, and I have documentation of your mental health issues during this pregnancy. If you push this too far, I'll fight for full custody of our child." The threat was delivered with the same casual cruelty that Marcus had perfected over months of psychological abuse. But this time, instead of cowering, Rebecca felt something new: righteous anger. "Mental health issues. You mean the anxiety and depression that you caused by hitting me? The mood swings that happened because your mother was drugging my prenatal vitamins? The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Marcus's face went white as he realized that Rebecca had figured out Grace's role in the systematic abuse. That's a serious accusation. Rebecca, you're clearly not thinking straight. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, Rebecca replied. Clear enough to know that you've been planning to steal from the foundation and flee the country. Clear enough to know that you never loved me. You just wanted access to my family's money and connections. At that moment, James Crawford appeared in the doorway with 2 federal agents and hospital security. Marcus Whitmore, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and charity fraud. You have the right to remain silent. The transformation in Marcus was immediate and terrifying. The charming facade disappeared entirely, replaced by pure rage. This is your fault, he screamed at Rebecca as the agents moved to handcuff him. I gave you everything. I made you somebody. Without me, you're nothing. Without you, Rebecca said calmly. I'm free. The words seemed to hit Marcus harder than any physical blow. He lunged toward Rebecca's bed, but the federal agents tackled him before he could reach her. You'll regret this, he shouted as they dragged him from the room. I'll destroy you. I'll destroy everything you care about. The threats echoed down the hallway as Marcus was taken into federal custody, but Rebecca felt no fear. For the first time in months, the man who had controlled her life through violence and intimidation was powerless to hurt her. James Crawford returned to the room a few minutes later, looking grimly satisfied. That was incredibly stupid of him, James said. Violating a restraining order, threatening a witness, attempting to intimidate a victim of federal crimes. He just added several more charges to his indictment. How long will he be in prison? Rebecca asked. With the charges we already have, plus what he just did here, we're looking at a minimum of 15 years, possibly 25. The charity fraud alone carries severe penalties, and threatening a witness in a federal investigation is a felony. William put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. It's over, sweetheart. He can't hurt you anymore. But even as Rebecca felt relief washing over her, she knew that the legal battle was just beginning. Marcus had threatened to fight for custody of their child, and she realized that even from prison, he might find ways to continue tormenting her. James, she said, what about the baby? Can he still claim parental rights from prison? James's expression grew serious. That's more complicated. Federal conviction doesn't automatically terminate parental rights, but given the circumstances, domestic violence, threats against you and the child, the fraud conviction, we can build a strong case for termination of his rights. And his mother, Grace, she was part of this conspiracy. She was drugging my vitamins, coaching Marcus on how to abuse me without leaving evidence. We'll need proof of that, James said. But if you're willing to testify, and if we can find physical evidence of the drugging, she could face charges for conspiracy, assault with a dangerous substance, and potentially attempted poisoning. Rebecca nodded firmly. I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they can never hurt me or my child. As federal agents continued their investigation, social media exploded with new details about the case. Videos of Marcus being arrested at the hospital went viral, and public opinion shifted even more decisively in Rebecca's favor. The woman who had been portrayed by her husband as emotional and unstable was now seen as a brave whistleblower who had exposed massive charity fraud despite personal danger. Donations to the Emma Foundation actually increased as people rallied to support a charity that had been victimized by its founder's husband. But the most important change was in Rebecca herself, the woman who had spent months walking on eggshells, measuring her words and living in fear, had found her voice again, and she was just getting started. Detective Lisa Hammond had investigated dozens of domestic violence cases during her 15 years with the police department. But the systematic nature of Marcus Whitmore's abuse was unlike anything she'd seen before. The evidence painted a picture of calculated psychological warfare designed to break Rebecca's spirit and isolate her from her support systems. Show me the building's security footage again, she said to the property manager of Rebecca and Marcus's luxury condominium building. The timestamp showed Marcus entering the building 3 weeks earlier, followed 20 minutes later by an older woman who Detective Hammond now knew was Grace Whitmore, Marcus's mother. This pattern repeats every few weeks, the property manager explained. Mrs. Whitmore visits for about an hour, then leaves. Usually there's some kind of disturbance in the penthouse, within a day or two of her visits. Detective Hammond had reviewed the incident reports filed by building security. Calls about shouting, breaking glass, and what residents described as loud arguments from the penthouse suite. Each time, Marcus had explained the incidents as his wife being clumsy or emotional due to pregnancy, but the security footage told a different story. "Here," Detective Hammond said, pointing to a timestamp from 6 weeks earlier. "Watch Mrs. Whitmore's body language when she enters the building versus when she leaves. When Grace arrived, she carried herself with the confident posture of someone on a mission. When she left an hour later, her demeanor was satisfied, almost pleased. She looked like someone who had just completed a successful task. And look at this," the property manager added, pulling up footage from 2 days later. "Mrs. Whitmore arriving again, but this time she's carrying what appears to be a small pharmacy bag." The evidence was circumstantial, but the pattern was clear. Grace would visit, coach her son on his abuse techniques, and sometimes bring supplies, possibly including the drugs she'd been adding to Rebecca's prenatal vitamins. Dr. Mitchell had confirmed that blood tests taken when Rebecca was admitted to the hospital showed traces of diazepam, a mild sedative that wouldn't harm the baby, but would cause dizziness, confusion, and mood swings in the mother. The dosage was carefully calculated to mimic pregnancy-related symptoms while undermining Rebecca's confidence in her own perceptions. "It's psychological warfare," Detective Hammond explained to William Sterling during a briefing at the hospital. "They weren't just physically abusing Rebecca. They were gaslighting her, making her question her own sanity." William's hands clenched into fists as he absorbed the full scope of what his daughter had endured. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the security footage and the pattern of incidents, we estimate at least 8 months. Possibly longer." The investigation had also uncovered something even more disturbing: medical records from Rebecca's previous miscarriage 18 months earlier. Dr. Mitchell had reviewed the emergency room records from that night, and the injuries weren't consistent with the stress-related miscarriage diagnosis that Marcus had insisted upon. "The pattern of bruising on her ribs suggests blunt force trauma," Dr. Mitchell explained to Detective Hammond. "Someone hit her hard enough to cause internal bleeding, which triggered the miscarriage." "So Marcus killed their first baby?" "It's likely, yes. And then he convinced Rebecca that it was her fault for working too hard and being too stressed." The psychological cruelty of that manipulation was staggering. Marcus had beaten his wife so severely that she miscarried, then convinced her that she was responsible for losing their child. The guilt and self-blame had made Rebecca even more vulnerable to his continued abuse. Meanwhile, federal investigators were uncovering the sophisticated financial scheme that Marcus had used to embezzle from the Emma Foundation. Agent Patricia Wong had traced the money through multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency exchanges. "He's been planning this for at least 2 years, she reported to James Crawford. "The shell companies were established before he even married Rebecca, which suggests he targeted her specifically for her family connections and access to the charity." The evidence suggested that Marcus's entire relationship with Rebecca had been a long-term fraud designed to position him for the eventual theft. He'd courted her not out of love, but as part of a calculated plan to gain access to millions of dollars in charity funds. "What about the flight records?" James asked. "We found bookings for private jets to 3 different countries without extradition treaties. He had multiple escape routes planned, all funded by the stolen charity money." The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Marcus hadn't just stolen from dying children. He'd manipulated a grieving woman's desire to honor her deceased brother's memory as part of his elaborate fraud scheme. Back at the hospital, Rebecca was struggling to process the psychological implications of what she learned. "He never loved me," she said to her father during one of their quiet conversations. "Our entire relationship was just a business plan. Sweetheart, I know this is painful, but try to remember that his deception doesn't reflect on your worth. You love genuinely, even if he didn't. But how could I have been so blind? How could I not see what he was doing?" Dr. Mitchell, who had joined them for this conversation, offered a different perspective. "Rebecca, you weren't blind. You were systematically manipulated by someone with extensive experience in psychological manipulation. The fact that you eventually discovered the truth and found the courage to expose it shows incredible strength." The doctor's words were echoed by the growing support Rebecca was receiving from the public. Social media was flooded with messages from domestic violence survivors who recognized the patterns of abuse and manipulation that Rebecca had endured. Believe Rebecca became a trending hashtag as women shared their own stories of financial abuse, gaslighting, and systematic intimidation. The conversation expanded beyond Rebecca's specific case to address broader issues of domestic violence and the ways that abusers use financial control to trap their victims. But perhaps the most powerful validation came from an unexpected source: other charities that had been targeted by similar schemes. We've been contacted by 8 other charitable organizations that suspect they may have been victims of similar fraud, James Crawford reported. It appears that Marcus may have been running multiple embezzlement schemes simultaneously. The revelation that Marcus might be a serial charity fraudster added new dimensions to the federal case. If prosecutors could prove a pattern of targeting charitable organizations, the charges could escalate to racketeering, which carried even more severe penalties. He's a predator, Rebecca realized, not just of women, but of charities that help vulnerable people. He systematically targets organizations that exist to help others. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted Marcus as a sophisticated sociopath who had perfected the art of identifying and exploiting compassionate people. He targeted charities focused on children's causes because he knew that people's emotional investment in helping children would make them less likely to scrutinize financial irregularities. And he targeted Rebecca specifically because her family's wealth and media influence could provide both access to donors and protection from suspicion. But Marcus had made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated the fury of a father whose daughter and grandchild had been threatened. William Sterling's media empire was now fully focused on exposing not just Marcus's crimes, but the broader patterns of charity fraud that preyed on people's generosity and compassion. The man who had built his fortune by holding powerful people accountable was about to teach Marcus Whitmore that some fights are too dangerous to pick. Grace Whitmore arrived at St. Mary's Hospital on Thursday morning, carrying flowers and wearing the perfectly composed expression of a concerned mother-in-law. To hospital staff, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed a worried grandmother to be, visiting her pregnant daughter-in-law. But Rebecca's blood pressure monitor started beeping the moment Grace walked into the room. "Hello, dear," Grace said with manufactured sweetness. "I thought you might like some fresh flowers. These are from the garden at the country house." Rebecca recognized the flowers immediately: belladonna and foxglove, both beautiful and both highly toxic. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Even bringing flowers, Grace found a way to threaten. "I don't want you here," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Now, Rebecca, I know you're upset about last night's misunderstanding, but family needs to stick together during difficult times." Grace settled into the visitor's chair with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her 63 years of life. Born into old money and married into more, she'd spent decades perfecting the art of getting what she wanted through a combination of social pressure and carefully veiled threats. "Where's my father?" Rebecca asked, looking toward the door. William stepped out to take some phone calls. Something about federal investigators and subpoenas. Such a fuss over a simple business disagreement. The casual dismissal of federal fraud charges as a business disagreement revealed everything about Grace's worldview. In her mind, rules and laws applied to other people, not to the Whitmores. "Marcus stole almost $4 million from a children's cancer charity," Rebecca said firmly. "That's not a disagreement. That's a felony." Grace's perfectly applied smile never wavered. "Marcus is a brilliant businessman who made some aggressive investment decisions with charity funds. If there were irregularities, I'm sure they can be sorted out with the proper legal representation. Investment decisions: he moved the money to personal accounts in the Cayman Islands. Offshore asset protection is perfectly legal, dear. Your father does it himself." The response revealed the sophisticated rationalization system that Grace had developed to justify her son's crimes. In her mind, theft became aggressive investment, fraud became asset protection, and embezzlement became savvy business practice. But Rebecca was no longer the confused, gaslit woman who had doubted her own perceptions for months. The evidence was overwhelming, and she wasn't going to let Grace rewrite reality. "He was planning to disappear," Rebecca said. "To take all the money and leave me with nothing but debt and a destroyed charity." For the first time, Grace's composure slipped slightly. A flash of something cold and calculating crossed her face before the sweet grandmother mask returned. Rebecca, you're being dramatic. Marcus would never abandon his child. His child, not me. Just his child. Well, yes, the child is what matters now. The sterling name, the family legacy, the inheritance. That baby represents the joining of two powerful families. Shubrin everyone. The casual admission revealed Grace's true motivations. Rebecca wasn't a person to be loved and protected. She was a vessel for creating the next generation of the Whitmore dynasty. The baby wasn't Marcus's child to be cherished. It was a genetic combination of sterling wealth and Whitmore ambition. I won't let you anywhere near my child, Rebecca said. Grace's smile turned predatory. Oh, dear, I don't think you understand the situation. Marcus has rights as a father, and I have rights as a grandmother. Even if he faces some legal difficulties, family courts prioritize the best interests of the child. A man in federal prison for embezzling from a children's cancer charity isn't going to get custody of anything. Federal prison, Rebecca. You're being hysterical. Marcus will face some fines, perhaps some community service. These white-collar matters rarely result in actual imprisonment for people of our social standing. The casual assumption that wealth and social position would protect Marcus from the consequences of his crimes demonstrated how completely disconnected Grace was from reality. She genuinely believed that the Whitmore name would shield her son from federal prosecution. And even if Marcus faces some temporary legal issues, Grace continued, I would be happy to help raise my grandchild. The baby would want for nothing: private schools, European tutors, all the advantages that come with the Whitmore name. Over my dead body, Grace's expression hardened. That can be arranged. The threat was delivered so casually that it took Rebecca a moment to process what Grace had actually said. When the words registered, Rebecca felt ice in her veins. Are you threatening to kill me? I'm simply pointing out that childbirth can be dangerous, especially for women under stress, particularly women who might not be taking their prenatal vitamins properly. The reference to the vitamins confirmed what Rebecca had suspected. Grace had been drugging her systematically, not just to cause confusion and mood swings, but possibly to complicate her pregnancy. You've been poisoning me. I've been helping you manage your anxiety and mood swings. Pregnancy can be so difficult for emotional women. Grace reached into her purse and pulled out a small bottle of prenatal vitamins, the same brand that Rebecca had been taking for months. I brought you some fresh vitamins, dear, the ones from home. I know how important it is for you to maintain your routine. Rebecca stared at the bottle, understanding with perfect clarity that Grace was offering her a choice: take the drug vitamins and remain compliant, or refuse and face the consequences. I'm not taking anything you give me. Grace's mask slipped completely. The sweet grandmother disappeared, replaced by a woman with cold, calculating eyes and the moral flexibility of a sociopath. Then you're making this harder than it needs to be. Marcus is my son, and that baby is my grandchild. I've spent 63 years getting what I want, and I'm not going to let a hysterical little girl destroy my family's legacy. Your family's legacy is fraud, embezzlement, and domestic violence. Our family's legacy is power, influence, and the ability to shape the world according to our will. Marcus may have been clumsy in his execution, but his instincts were correct. Your father's money, your family's connections, and our grandchild's inheritance will secure the Whitmore position for generations. The conversation revealed the full scope of Grace's involvement in Marcus's schemes. This wasn't just a case of a mother protecting her criminal son. This was a carefully orchestrated plan to merge two wealthy families and position the next generation for maximum power and influence. And if Marcus goes to prison, Rebecca asked, then I'll raise my grandchild myself, with appropriate financial support from the Sterling Family Trust. William won't want his grandchild to suffer because of his daughter's poor judgment in marriage partners. The audacity was breathtaking. Grace was planning to use Rebecca's own child as leverage against her, banking on William Sterling's love for his grandchild to secure ongoing financial support for the Whitmore family. You're insane. I'm practical. Family is everything, Rebecca, and like it or not, we're family now. At that moment, William Sterling appeared in the doorway, having heard enough of the conversation to understand exactly what kind of woman his daughter had been dealing with. No, he said firmly, you're not family. You're a co-conspirator in fraud, systematic abuse, and attempted poisoning, and you're about to be arrested." Grace turned toward William with her sweet grandmother's smile returning. "William, how lovely to see you. I was just explaining to Rebecca how important it is for families to support each other during difficult times. Detective Hammond is in the hallway with a warrant for your arrest. Grace, it seems that forensic analysis of Rebecca's blood work confirmed the presence of unlawfully administered sedatives. Combined with the security footage of your visits and your son's confession about your coaching sessions, that constitutes conspiracy to commit assault with a dangerous substance." For the first time in her adult life, Grace Whitmore faced consequences that her money and social position couldn't deflect. The reality of federal charges and potential imprisonment finally penetrated her bubble of entitlement. "This is ridiculous," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I was helping Rebecca manage her anxiety. You were systematically drugging a pregnant woman to make her more vulnerable to psychological and physical abuse," William replied. "That's attempted poisoning, and it carries a sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison." As Detective Hammond entered the room with handcuffs, Grace made one final attempt to maintain control. "You'll regret this, Rebecca. That baby belongs to the Whitmore family, and we always get what belongs to us." But as Grace was led away in handcuffs, her threats rang hollow. The woman who had spent decades manipulating people through fear and social pressure was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Rebecca watched her mother-in-law being arrested and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: complete safety. The two people who had systematically terrorized her were now in federal custody, unable to hurt her or her child. For the first time since her wedding day, Rebecca could imagine a future free from fear. The federal courthouse was surrounded by news vans and protesters when Marcus Whitmore was brought in for his arraignment. The case had captured national attention, not just because of the dramatic assault at the Gala, but because it represented something larger: the intersection of domestic violence, white-collar crime, and the abuse of charitable organizations. James Crawford stood at the prosecutor's table with a thick folder of evidence that represented months of forensic accounting and federal investigation. Across from him, Marcus's defense team looked like they were preparing for a battle they knew they couldn't win. "Your Honor," Crawford began, "the United States charges Marcus James Whitmore with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, embezzlement of charitable funds, witness intimidation, and violation of federal anti-domestic violence statutes." The list of charges was devastating. Each count carried significant prison time, and the combination meant that Marcus was facing a potential sentence of 25 to 30 years in federal prison. Marcus, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and shackled at the wrists and ankles, bore little resemblance to the confident CEO who had been celebrated just days earlier. His usual perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his face was pale, and his eyes had the hollow look of a man who finally understood that his carefully constructed world had collapsed completely. Judge Patricia Chen, a no-nonsense federal judge with a reputation for harsh sentences in white-collar crime cases, reviewed the charges with methodical precision. "Mr. Whitmore, do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And how do you plead?" Marcus's lead attorney, David Richardson, stood up. "Not guilty to all charges, Your Honor." The plea was expected, but the evidence against Marcus was overwhelming. Federal investigators had found a paper trail that documented every aspect of his embezzlement scheme, from the initial setup of shell companies to the final transfers to offshore accounts. "Your Honor," Crawford continued, "the government requests that Mr. Whitmore be held without bail. He has demonstrated a clear flight risk, as evidenced by his attempts to transfer millions of dollars to accounts in non-extradition countries. He has also shown a pattern of intimidating and threatening witnesses, including his pregnant wife whom he assaulted in front of 500 witnesses." Richardson objected immediately. "Your Honor, my client is a respected businessman with deep ties to the community. The government's characterization of alleged financial irregularities as flight preparation is pure speculation." Judge Chen was not impressed. "Counselor, your client was found with confirmed reservations on private jets to 3 different countries, all of which lack extradition treaties with the United States. He was also discovered attempting to liquidate assets and transfer funds to untraceable cryptocurrency accounts. That goes beyond alleged financial irregularities. While the arraignment proceeded, Rebecca watched from her hospital bed via video link. William had arranged for a secure connection that would allow her to observe the proceedings without the stress of traveling to the courthouse. Seeing Marcus in shackles and an orange jumpsuit was surreal. The man who had controlled her life through fear and violence now looked small and powerless. The charming mask that had fooled so many people was completely gone, replaced by the desperate expression of a cornered animal. The defendant will be held without bail pending trial, Judge Chen announced. Given the severity of the charges, the flight risk, and the pattern of witness intimidation, I find that no amount of bail would ensure the defendant's appearance at trial or the safety of potential witnesses. Marcus's shoulders sagged as the reality of his situation hit him. He would remain in federal custody until his trial, which could be months away. His life of luxury penthouse apartments, expensive cars, and exclusive social clubs was over forever. But Richardson wasn't finished fighting. Your Honor, we request that our client be allowed to make a statement. Judge Chen looked skeptical but nodded. Make it brief. Counselor. Marcus stood slowly, his shackles clanking as he moved. When he spoke, his voice carried a hint of his old arrogance. Your Honor, I want the court to know that my wife is suffering from severe pregnancy-related mental health issues. The accusations she's made are the product of paranoid delusions and postpartum psychosis. I've been trying to get her the help she needs, but her father has been manipulating her for his own purposes. The statement was classic. Marcus deflecting blame, gaslighting his victim, and attempting to manipulate the system even from federal custody. But this time, his words fell on deaf ears. Crawford was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, the defendant's statement demonstrates exactly why he must remain in custody. Even now, facing overwhelming evidence of his crimes, he continues to blame and intimidate his victim. This is textbook abuser behavior. Judge Chen's expression hardened. Mr. Whitmore, I've reviewed the evidence in this case, including security footage of your assault on your pregnant wife, forensic accounting that traces stolen funds through multiple shell companies, and medical evidence of systematic abuse. Your characterization of your wife as mentally unstable is not only factually unsupported, but demonstrates a concerning lack of remorse for your actions. Marcus tried to interrupt, but Judge Chen cut him off. Furthermore, your attempt to blame your wife's father for your own criminal behavior shows that you continue to view yourself as a victim rather than accepting responsibility for your choices. This court will not be manipulated by such tactics. The rebuke was devastating, and Marcus finally seemed to understand that his usual methods of charm and manipulation would not work in federal court. As the arraignment concluded, Crawford announced that the government would be seeking additional charges based on ongoing investigation. Your Honor, we have reason to believe that Mr. Whitmore may have defrauded multiple charitable organizations over several years. We are coordinating with other federal districts to investigate a potential pattern of charity fraud that could constitute racketeering charges. The possibility of RICO charges sent a visible shock through Marcus's defense team. Racketeering charges carried even more severe penalties and would transform the case from simple embezzlement to organized criminal enterprise. Back at the hospital, Rebecca felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched her husband's downfall. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also sadness for the man she thought she had married. That man, she now realized, had never really existed. How do you feel? Dr. Mitchell asked after the video feed ended. Empty, Rebecca replied honestly. I spent so much time being afraid of him, being controlled by him, that I don't know what I'm supposed to feel now that he's powerless. That's completely normal, Dr. Mitchell assured her. You've been living in survival mode for months. It takes time to adjust to safety. William took his daughter's hand. You don't have to feel anything specific. Sweetheart, there's no right way to process this. As news of Marcus's arraignment spread, public support for Rebecca continued to grow. The Emma Foundation received hundreds of thousands of dollars in new donations from people who wanted to support childhood cancer research and show solidarity with abuse survivors. Corporate sponsors who had initially distanced themselves from the charity when the embezzlement was revealed now returned with increased funding commitments. The foundation that Marcus had tried to destroy was emerging stronger than ever. But perhaps most importantly, Rebecca was beginning to rediscover her own strength. The woman who had been systematically broken down by months of abuse was slowly rebuilding herself, one day at a time. The legal battle was far from over, but for the first time in months, Rebecca could see light at the end of the tunnel. 3 weeks later, Rebecca was finally able to leave the hospital. Her pregnancy had stabilized, and while she still needed complete bed rest, Dr. Mitchell felt confident that she could safely recover at home under careful medical supervision. William had prepared the guest suite at his estate as a secure haven for his daughter. The room was equipped with medical monitoring equipment, a direct line to Dr. Mitchell, and 24-hour security that ensured Marcus's associates couldn't attempt any retaliation. But the most important preparation was legal. James Crawford and his team were building one of the most comprehensive white-collar crime cases in federal court history, and Rebecca's testimony would be the centerpiece of their prosecution. "The evidence is overwhelming," Crawford explained during a preparation session at William's house. "We have forensic accounting that traces every stolen dollar, security footage of the systematic abuse, medical evidence of the poisoning, and Marcus's own recorded threats. But your testimony will tie it all together and show the jury the human cost of his crimes." Rebecca sat propped up in bed, surrounded by legal documents and financial records that painted the complete picture of Marcus's betrayal. The scope of the fraud was even larger than initially suspected. Federal investigators had discovered that Marcus had targeted 7 different charitable organizations over 3 years, stealing a total of $12 million meant for causes ranging from childhood cancer research to veteran support services. "He's a serial predator," Rebecca said as she reviewed the evidence. "He specifically targets charities that help vulnerable populations because he knows people are less likely to scrutinize emotional donations." Exactly. And his method was always the same: identify a charity with weak financial oversight, cultivate a relationship with someone who had access to funds, and gradually take control of the financial systems. The pattern was chillingly consistent. Marcus would research potential targets, often focusing on charities founded by people who had experienced personal loss. He understood that grief-driven organizations were more likely to trust charismatic volunteers who claimed to share their mission. "What about Grace?" Rebecca asked. "What kind of sentence is she facing? Conspiracy charges, attempted poisoning, and accessory to fraud. She's looking at 8 to 12 years in federal prison. Her lawyers are trying to negotiate a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Marcus, but we don't need her cooperation. The evidence speaks for itself." The investigation had revealed that Grace's role went far beyond coaching her son on abuse techniques. She had been actively involved in researching potential targets, establishing shell companies, and managing the offshore accounts used to hide stolen money. In many ways, she was the mastermind behind the operation, using Marcus as the front man while she pulled the strings from behind the scenes. "She saw me as a means to an end," Rebecca realized. "A way to access my family's wealth and social connections while positioning Marcus for bigger scores." "The marriage itself appears to have been part of the fraud," Crawford confirmed. "Phone records show that Grace and Marcus researched your family extensively before he first approached you at that charity fundraiser. They knew about your brother's death, your emotional vulnerability around childhood cancer, and your family's financial resources." The revelation that even their first meeting had been orchestrated was devastating. Rebecca had always believed that Marcus had genuinely fallen in love with her, that their shared commitment to fighting childhood cancer had brought them together naturally. Now she understood that every moment of their relationship had been calculated manipulation. "I feel so stupid," she said quietly. William, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up. "Sweetheart, you were targeted by professional criminals who had years of experience manipulating victims. The fact that you eventually discovered the truth and found the courage to expose them shows incredible intelligence and strength." Dr. Ma Mitchell, who had joined them for the legal preparation session, offered a medical perspective on Rebecca's psychological journey. "The systematic gaslighting and drugging were designed to undermine your confidence in your own perceptions," she explained. "Most victims in your situation never break free from that psychological control. The fact that you trusted your instincts and investigated the suspicious financial activity shows remarkable resilience." As they prepared for trial, Rebecca was also dealing with the practical challenges of rebuilding her life. The penthouse apartment she had shared with Marcus was now crime scene evidence, sealed by federal investigators. Her personal belongings had been contaminated by months of abuse and manipulation. "I don't want anything from that place," she told William. "I want to start completely fresh." William understood his daughter's need for a clean break. He arranged for professional movers to retrieve only the most essential items while discarding everything that carried memories of her marriage to Marcus. Meanwhile, the Emma Foundation was experiencing an unprecedented surge in support. The story of a charity being victimized by its founder's husband had touched a nerve with the public, generating millions of dollars in new donations and volunteer support. "We're receiving calls from medical researchers who want to partner with us," Nicole Barnes reported during one of her visits. As Rebecca's attorney and closest friend, Nicole had taken on the role of managing the foundation during Rebecca's recovery. The University of Chicago wants to establish an Emma Foundation Research Chair for Pediatric Oncology. Johns Hopkins is proposing a collaboration on a new treatment protocol for childhood leukemia. The irony was profound. Marcus's attempt to destroy the foundation had instead elevated it to national prominence and created opportunities for research partnerships that would have taken years to develop under normal circumstances. "Tommy would have loved this," Rebecca said, thinking of her brother who had died at age 12. "He always said that something good had to come from something so terrible." As her due date approached, Rebecca found herself thinking more about the future than the past. The baby she was carrying would be born free from Marcus's influence, raised without fear or manipulation, and surrounded by love and support. "Have you thought about names, Doctor?" Mitchell asked during one of her regular checkups. "Emma Grace," Rebecca replied immediately. "Emma for the foundation and for new beginnings. Grace because it's what I want to show the world, even after everything that's happened." The name choice represented Rebecca's commitment to transformation rather than revenge. She was choosing to honor her brother's memory in her own journey toward healing rather than being defined by Marcus's crimes. But even as she prepared for new life, the legal battle continued. Marcus's trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, and his lawyers were making increasingly desperate attempts to avoid a conviction that would send their client to federal prison for decades. "They're proposing a plea deal," Crawford informed Rebecca during their final preparation session. Marcus would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a 15-year sentence and full restitution to the defrauded charities. "What do you think?" "I think we have such a strong case that there's no reason to accept any deal. The evidence is overwhelming, and a jury trial will send a clear message that charity fraud and domestic violence have serious consequences." Rebecca nodded firmly. "Then we go to trial. I want the whole truth to come out. I want other victims to see that it's possible to fight back and win." As they prepared for the trial that would determine Marcus's fate, Rebecca realized that she had already won the most important victory, her freedom. The woman who had been systematically broken down by months of abuse had rebuilt herself into someone stronger and more determined than ever before. Marcus had tried to destroy her, but instead he had created an adversary who would fight not just for herself, but for every victim of domestic violence and charity fraud. The trial would be her final confrontation with the man who had terrorized her, and she was ready to face him with the full force of truth and justice on her side. The federal courthouse steps were packed with supporters holding signs reading, "Justice for Rebecca" and "Protect our charities." When Marcus Whitmore's trial began on a cold Monday morning in February, the case had become a symbol of the fight against domestic violence and charity fraud, drawing national media attention and inspiring similar investigations across the country. Rebecca, now 34 weeks pregnant, testified via secure video link from a specially prepared room at her father's estate. The medical team had determined that the stress of appearing in court could trigger premature labor, but Rebecca insisted on testifying in person rather than through recorded depositions. "I need to look at him when I tell the truth," she had told James Crawford. "I need him to see that I'm not afraid of him anymore." As Rebecca's image appeared on the courtroom monitors, she looked directly at Marcus for the first time since his arrest. The man who had once controlled her through fear and violence now sat in an orange jumpsuit, flanked by federal marshals, powerless to hurt her. "Mrs. Sterling," Crawford began, using Rebecca's maiden name, which she had legally reclaimed, "please tell the jury about your relationship with the defendant." Rebecca's voice was clear and steady as she described how Marcus had courted her, gradually isolated her from friends and family, and begun the systematic abuse that had escalated over 18 months of marriage. "He didn't start hitting me right away," she explained. "First, he undermined my confidence, made me doubt my own perceptions, convinced me that I was lucky to have him. The physical violence came later, once he was sure I wouldn't fight back." The jury listened in rapt attention as Rebecca described the calculated nature of the abuse, the way Marcus had used her pregnancy to increase his control, and the devastating discovery that he had been stealing from the charity she had founded to honor her deceased brother. "When I found the offshore accounts and shell companies on his phone, I realized that our entire marriage had been a fraud. He didn't love me. He saw me as a means to access my family's wealth and social connections." Marcus's defense attorney, David Richardson, attempted to portray Rebecca as an unreliable witness whose testimony was colored by pregnancy hormones and mental health issues. "Mrs. Sterling, isn't it true that you've been under significant emotional stress during your pregnancy?" "Yes," Rebecca replied calmly. "The stress of being systematically abused, manipulated, and robbed by my husband. And isn't it possible that your interpretation of normal business activities was influenced by your emotional state?" Rebecca's response was devastating in its simplicity. Normal business activities don't require shell companies in the Cayman Islands or flight reservations to countries without extradition treaties. The cross-examination backfired spectacularly. Instead of undermining Rebecca's credibility, Richardson's questions only highlighted the thoroughness of her investigation and the strength of her evidence. As Rebecca's testimony concluded, she felt a sudden sharp pain in her abdomen. The stress of confronting Marcus, combined with the physical demands of late pregnancy, had triggered the early stages of labor. "I need to stop," she said to the camera. "The baby is coming." The courtroom erupted in chaos as news spread that Rebecca was going into labor during her testimony. Dr. Mitchell and the medical team immediately began preparations for an emergency delivery while the judge recessed the trial. But Rebecca insisted on completing her testimony from the delivery room. "This baby represents everything Marcus tried to destroy," she said between contractions. "I want the jury to understand that his crimes didn't just steal money, they threatened the life of an innocent child." The image of Rebecca giving testimony while in active labor was broadcast live on news channels across the country. The visual metaphor was powerful, new life emerging as justice was finally served. 3 hours later, Emma Grace Sterling was born healthy and strong at 5 pounds, 7 ounces. Her first cries were broadcast live to the courthouse, where the jury was waiting to resume deliberations. "She's beautiful," Dr. Mitchell announced as she placed the baby in Rebecca's arms. "And she's a fighter, just like her mother." Rebecca's first words to her daughter were captured on video and would be replayed millions of times in the days that followed. "We're free, baby girl. We're finally free." As news of Emma's birth spread, the jury returned to the courthouse with a sense of purpose. The testimony they had heard, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, left no doubt about Marcus's guilt. The deliberation lasted only 4 hours. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty," the jury foreman announced. "On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of embezzlement of charitable funds, we find the defendant guilty." Each guilty verdict hit Marcus like a physical blow. By the time the jury finished reading all 17 counts, he was slumped in his chair, the reality of spending the rest of his life in federal prison finally sinking in. Judge Chen scheduled sentencing for the following week, but the verdict was already making headlines around the world. The case had become a landmark prosecution that demonstrated the serious consequences of domestic violence and charity fraud. Social media exploded with messages of support for Rebecca and baby Emma. The hashtag #DuckShorterEmmaGraceFree became a rallying cry for domestic violence survivors and charity fraud victims. But perhaps the most satisfying response came from an unexpected source, other law enforcement agencies that had opened investigations into similar cases inspired by Rebecca's courage. "We've received tips about potential charity fraud in 12 different states," James Crawford reported. "Your decision to speak out has encouraged other victims to come forward." The ripple effects of Rebecca's testimony were being felt across the country as prosecutors reopened cold cases and investigated charities that had reported suspicious financial activities. Meanwhile, Grace Whitmore's trial was proceeding on a separate track. Faced with overwhelming evidence of her role in the conspiracy, Her lawyers had negotiated a plea deal that would send her to federal prison for 10 years in exchange for her cooperation in other ongoing investigations. Grace's allocution was a masterpiece of narcissistic deflection. Even as she pleaded guilty to conspiracy and attempted poisoning charges, she maintained that she had been trying to help Rebecca manage her emotional instability. "I thought I was doing what was best for the family," she told Judge Chen during her sentencing hearing. "I never intended for anyone to be hurt." Judge Chen was not impressed. "Mrs. Whitmore, you systematically drugged a pregnant woman, coached your son on techniques for domestic abuse, and participated in stealing millions of dollars from charitable organizations that help vulnerable children. Your actions were calculated, deliberate, and cruel." The 10-year sentence meant that Grace would be in her 70s when she was released from federal prison. Her social standing, her wealth, and her influence were gone forever. But for Rebecca, the most important victory wasn't the criminal convictions or the prison sentences. It was the transformation she saw in herself as she held her daughter for the first time. The woman who had been systematically broken down by months of abuse had rebuilt herself into someone stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever before. She had not only survived Marcus's attempt to destroy her, she had emerged victorious. Emma Grace Sterling had been born into a world where justice was possible, where truth could triumph over manipulation, and where love was stronger than fear. And her mother had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to let someone else's darkness dim her light. 6 months after Marcus's conviction, Rebecca stood in the newly renovated headquarters of the Emma Grace Foundation, watching her daughter sleep peacefully in a bassinet beside her desk. The baby who had been born during her mother's testimony had become a symbol of hope and resilience for domestic violence survivors around the world. The foundation that Marcus had tried to destroy was now the largest privately funded childhood cancer research organization in the United States. The attempted embezzlement had generated so much publicity and sympathy that donations had increased by 500%, allowing the foundation to fund research projects that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The University of Pennsylvania wants to establish an Emma Grace Research Center, Nicole Barnes reported during their weekly board meeting. "They're offering to match our funding dollar for the next 5 years." Rebecca smiled as she reviewed the proposals stacked on her desk. Partnership offers from Johns Hopkins, Stanford, the Mayo Clinic, and Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Research grants that would fund studies into new treatment protocols, early detection methods, and quality of life improvements for childhood cancer patients. "Tommy would be amazed," she said, thinking of her brother who had died fighting leukemia at age 12. "He always believed that something good could come from something terrible." The foundation's growth had exceeded everyone's expectations. What started as Rebecca's personal mission to honor her brother's memory had evolved into a national movement that was changing how childhood cancer research was funded and conducted. "We've also received a letter from the White House," Nicole continued. "The president wants to invite you to speak at the National Domestic Violence Awareness Month event." Rebecca looked down at Emma, who was beginning to stir in her bassinet. At 6 months old, the baby had her mother's determined expression and her grandfather's sharp, intelligent eyes. She was thriving in an environment of love, security, and endless possibility. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of public speaking," Rebecca admitted. "This whole journey has been about healing and moving forward, not becoming a political symbol." William Sterling, who had been quietly reviewing financial reports in the corner of the room, looked up with a proud smile. "Sweetheart, you've already become much more than a political symbol. You've become proof that it's possible to transform trauma into purpose." The numbers supported his assessment. The Emma Grace Foundation had raised over $50 million in 6 months, funded 12 major research initiatives, and established support programs for families dealing with childhood cancer in 37 states. But perhaps more importantly, Rebecca's story had inspired legislative changes across the country. 15 states had strengthened their charity fraud statutes. Federal prosecutors had created specialized units for investigating nonprofit embezzlement, and domestic violence organizations had received increased funding for programs that addressed financial abuse. "The ripple effects keep expanding," James Crawford said during one of his regular check-ins. As the federal prosecutor who had secured Marcus's conviction, he had become something of a celebrity in legal circles. We've opened investigations into charity fraud in 23 states based on tips from people who heard your story. Marcus himself was serving his 25-year sentence at a federal penitentiary in Colorado, where he would remain until he was 63 years old. His appeals had been denied, his assets had been liquidated to pay restitution to the defrauded charities, and his once glamorous lifestyle had been reduced to prison uniforms and cafeteria meals. Grace Whitmore was serving her 10-year sentence at a federal women's facility in Texas. According to reports from the prison, she continued to maintain that she had been trying to help Rebecca and that the whole situation had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by the media. Some people never accept responsibility for their actions, Dr. Mitchell observed during one of Emma's regular checkups. But the important thing is that they can't hurt you anymore. Rebecca nodded, but her attention was focused on the future rather than the past. Emma was growing stronger every day, hitting all her developmental milestones and showing signs of the intelligence and determination that ran in both sides of her family. She's going to grow up in a completely different world than the one I grew up in, Rebecca said, watching her daughter reach for a colorful toy. A world where she'll know from the beginning that she has value, that her voice matters, and that she never has to accept abuse from anyone. The transformation in Rebecca herself was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The woman who had spent months walking on eggshells, measuring her words, and living in fear had evolved into a confident leader who spoke truth to power and inspired others to find their own courage. "You've become the person you were always meant to be," William observed. "Marcus tried to break you, but instead he removed all the barriers that were holding you back." As if to underscore her grandfather's point, Emma chose that moment to pull herself up to a standing position in her playpen, holding on to the rails with determined little fists and looking around the room with bright, curious eyes. "She's going to be walking soon," Dr. Mitchell predicted. "And knowing her genetics, she'll probably be running by the time she's 10 months old." The image of Emma taking her first steps in the foundation offices, surrounded by the work being done in her honor, seemed fitting. This little girl would grow up understanding that her existence represented triumph over evil, hope over despair, and love over fear. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a notification that made her smile. A message from a childhood cancer survivor in Oregon, whose family had received support from the foundation. "My daughter just finished her last round of chemotherapy. The doctors say she's in complete remission. Thank you for making the research possible that saved her life." Messages like that arrived every day now, from families across the country whose children had benefited from the foundation's work. Each one reminded Rebecca why she had found the courage to expose Marcus's crimes and fight for justice. "Emma's going to grow up knowing that her name is associated with saving lives," Rebecca said, picking up her daughter and holding her close. "She'll understand from the beginning that she has the power to make a difference in the world." As the afternoon sun streamed through the foundation offices, Rebecca felt a profound sense of peace. The nightmare that had begun with Marcus's first act of violence had transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. The money he had stolen had been returned with interest through the generosity of donors who were inspired by the story of survival and justice. The charity he had tried to destroy was now stronger and more influential than ever. The woman he had tried to break had rebuilt herself into someone capable of changing the world. At that moment, a messenger arrived with an envelope bearing familiar handwriting. Rebecca recognized Marcus's penmanship immediately and felt her stomach clench with instinctive fear. "What is it?" Nicole asked, noticing Rebecca's expression. "A letter from Marcus." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated what Marcus might have to say from his prison cell. His previous attempts at communication had been intercepted by his lawyers and federal authorities, but apparently this one had made it through the system. Rebecca held the envelope for a long moment, remembering the months when Marcus's words had the power to control her emotions and actions. His threats, his gaslighting, his manipulation had once been weapons that he used to maintain psychological control over her. But that woman no longer existed. Without hesitation, Rebecca walked to the shredder beside her desk and fed the unopened letter into the machine. The paper disappeared with a satisfying mechanical whir. Marcus's words destroyed without ever being read. "I don't need to know what he has to say," she explained to the surprised faces around her. "His opinion of me, his version of events, his attempts at manipulation, none of that matters anymore. Emma gurgled happily in her mother's arms, reaching for the colorful mobile that hung above the foundation's reception area. The baby who would never know fear, never doubt her worth, and never question her right to safety and love. "This is what power looks like," Rebecca said, gesturing around the foundation offices filled with research proposals, partnership agreements, and thank you letters from grateful families. Not the power to control or manipulate or hurt people, but the power to heal, to help, and to create something meaningful from tragedy. As the sun set over the city, Rebecca Sterling looked out at a world that was measurably better because she had found the courage to speak truth about domestic violence and charity fraud. The ripple effects of her decision to expose Marcus's crimes were still spreading, inspiring other victims to come forward and creating systemic changes in how society addressed these issues. Emma Grace Sterling would grow up in that better world, surrounded by love and protected by the strength her mother had discovered in herself. She would know from her earliest memories that justice was possible, that truth could triumph over lies, and that even the darkest situations could be transformed into sources of light and hope. The woman who had once been broken by abuse had become unbreakable. The charity that had been targeted for destruction had become a force for healing. The child who had been threatened before birth had become a symbol of resilience and new beginnings. Marcus Whitmore had tried to write a story of control, manipulation, and theft. But Rebecca Sterling had rewritten it as a story of courage, justice, and redemption. And that story was just beginning. In the months and years to come, the Emma Grace Foundation would fund breakthrough treatments that would save thousands of children's lives. Rebecca would become a sought-after speaker and advocate whose story would inspire legislative changes and cultural shifts in how society addressed domestic violence. Emma would grow up to become a doctor herself, following in the footsteps of the woman who had delivered her and inspired by the foundation that bore her name. She would dedicate her career to pediatric oncology, continuing the mission that her mother had started and her uncle's memory had inspired. But perhaps most importantly, she would grow up knowing that no matter how dark the world might seem, there was always the possibility of transformation, always the chance for justice, and always the power to choose light over darkness. The letter from Marcus lay in pieces in the shredder, his words finally powerless to hurt the woman who had found her voice and refused to be silenced. Rebecca Sterling had won the ultimate victory. She had taken back control of her own story and used it to change the world. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. If this story moved you, hit that like button to help others find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that justice is possible, even in the darkest situations. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because stories like this one prove that truth really can triumph over lies. And I've got more incredible true stories coming your way. Your engagement helps these important stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Let me know in the comments what struck you most about Rebecca's journey from victim to victor.